list of these Old Testament heroes who God is using through this letter to us as examples of living by faith. And the benefit in learning from these guys that we're reading about is simply this, that it tells us earlier on in this chapter that without faith it is impossible to please God. So the reality is if we're not walking by faith, if we're not living by faith, then we're not pleasing God. And that even goes to the point of if we're trying to do this by works, and if you're trying to work your way to heaven, if you're trying to work your way into an approval place with God, it's just not going to work. Our relationship with Him is based on our faith in what Christ has done. And you and I know that as long as we try to work to earn the brownie points and approval, the fact is, we're just not going to cut the mustard, are we? You know, we fail and slip and slide all over the place. And so it's by faith. And that's what the writer is trying to do. That's what God is saying to us through the author of this letter to the Hebrews. Last week we looked at Abraham and taught us one major thing, and that is faith always includes obedience. A lot of people say, yeah, I've got faith. But then they don't really obey the law. And they don't do what God wants them to do. So therefore, I've got to conclude that they're not living by faith. Faith always includes obedience. We will obey what God says. And also something else that Abraham taught us, and it was this, that living in this world isn't permanent. That took you by surprise, I suppose. That's pretty deep. You know, living on this earth is not permanent. Especially for us, we are sojourners. We are pilgrims. We are moving on and we keep our eyes upon the place that is prepared for us, not made with human hands. And that's what Abraham had before him at all times. The reality that there was something far greater, even though he was wealthy, it meant nothing to him because he was looking ahead to what God has prepared for him. So let's move on now and look at some of these other guys, but we'll just finish off with Abraham here in verse 17. It says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. So it says there he offered up Isaac. And we know the story. We're not going to go into detail of that story this morning. But we know the story where he took his son up to the mount and was prepared to sacrifice his son to the Lord. You can read it in Genesis chapter 22. But it's kind of intriguing to me that, you know what, Abraham waited for something like 25 years for the promise of God to be fulfilled. You know, that I'm going to give you a son, and through him, you know, there's going to be multitudes and so forth. And there's this great promise that God gave to Abraham. But he waited for something like 25 years. And then when the son came along and grew, then God says, now I want you to take your only son and sacrifice him. And so God was putting Abraham to the test. But he'd given him that promise back in chapter 15 and the first 6 verses of Genesis that through Isaac, his only begotten son. We know that he had another son thanks to his wife's assistance in Hagar, Ishmael, and of course there's so much trouble in the Middle East now because of that. But God only recognised the one Isaac, and that was the one that God said, you take him up and you sacrifice him to me. And so we see this story where Isaac had to take his son, and he went with his servants and he said, you guys wait here. We're going to go up to the mountain and worship, and then we will come back. And so it indicates to us that Abraham had faith in God. Abraham knew that God had given him the promise. Abraham knew that God had spoken and said, through that one, Isaac, there's going to be the great blessing of the inheritance. So Abraham knew, I don't understand this, God. I don't fully get the picture, but I'm taking up my only son, the one you promised me, and I'm going to fulfill the command that you gave me, because I know that somehow we both are going to come back to the servants and go on. And so, you know, it says that when he was tested, he offered up Isaac. So he did offer up Isaac. And you know the story that and he wasn't just a little boy where he says, come here, son. tie her up, put him on. He was later on in, like, what would you call it, youth, young adult, and so he could have biffed his old dad and run off down the hill, but he stayed true to his father and all. But it says that Abraham offered him, and what it means here in the Greek language here, it's really neat, and I think we need to understand this here. It says that in Abraham's heart, he had already offered up Isaac. So here he is walking up with maybe Isaac, I guess, his shoulders loaded up with all the wood, the kindling, or whatever you call it, and going up there to have this sacrifice, and already in Abraham's mind, Isaac had been offered up. In other words, there was no turning back. He's not thinking to himself, okay, we've got about 55 steps now. How on earth am I going to get out of this? How are we going to change the course? Abraham said, in my heart and my mind, Isaac is already sacrificed. So that's why the writer here says Abraham did offer up Isaac, because it already had taken place in his heart. Aren't you glad that God looks at our heart? He knows what's going on in our heart, even though we have all these other weaknesses and failings. He's always looking at our hearts. We forget that sometimes. But for Abraham, there was no doubt, no apprehension along the way. His trust in God was absolute. Here's Isaac, the proof of the promise. The proof that God keeps his word. And the promise was through Isaac. And so Abraham said, well, that's it, let's go. And it's just interesting for us to see here that Abraham acted solely upon the word of God. This is what God says. This is what I do. This is where God says to go. This is where I go. Is that how you live? Is that like an attitude you have every day? Or sometimes you get up and go, well, I'm going to do this because I want to do this. And I'm not going to do that because I don't want to do that. But when God gives you a promise or God gives you instruction, I pray that your response is one of those that says, well, God said it and I'm just going to do it. Well, God said go there, I'm just going to go. God said to speak to that, but I'm going to speak to that person. And just have that kind of attitude, just like we read about Abraham here. Just acting upon the promise of God, the instruction of God. And the other thing I noticed about this story with Abraham was the conflict that he had with his only begotten son. It was present there before him. It was tangible. Here's my son. I can hug and this is my boy. This is the promise of God. But there was another side that he had to deal with, and that was the trust in God, trusting in the unseen. This is what it says in verse 1, you see, by faith. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So Abraham was prepared to live by that. Doesn't it just show us something about the life of Abraham? His faith in God and his faith in God's ability to be able to raise his son up, even though this was a rather big test for him. But he does say there in that verse, in verse 19, concluding that God was able to raise him up. The word is like a mathematical kind of word. It's a making a calculation. It's a reckoning. In other words, he wasn't making a decision on blind faith. Sometimes, you hear about people saying, I'm just going to leap off this building, because God can do wonders. And it's just like it's a blind faith. It's not under direction from God or anything. The word concluding here means that Abraham went, let me see. Okay, well, God promised me a son, and even though I waited 25 years, he gave me that son. It's the son of the promise. Through him, the promise will be that there will be a great inheritance and a multitude of people. God said, and so he concluded. He made that. You know what I'm trying to say. He actually worked it out. It wasn't just some thing of, did he just fling in the air? Or like some people, I know, they get the Bible and go, well, what's God saying today? And finding out what God, he can talk like that, I suppose, and show somebody, but that's not the normal way. That's just hoping for the best. But Abraham concluded, and it was all based on the promise of God. It was based on the fact that God had given him a son. It's based on the reality that God will raise him up. In Isaac shall your seed be called, it says in Romans 9. So Paul understood the whole reality of that as well. And that's what Abraham acted on. And I want to tell you this morning that for you and I, it's no different than Abraham. We can reckon on God today. We can conclude that God is faithful. That was part of what we were praying and worshipping this morning through our music, that God is faithful. We can reckon on God being with us. But you say, but Daryl, you don't know what I've been through. You don't know some of the pressures and some of the things that are happening to us now and going around us, and it's tough. God is faithful, gang. God is faithful. We can reckon on that. Calculate it. Go back, if you will, and start recalling some of the things that God has seen you through. And it's just, in your own heart and spirit that this couldn't be anything else but God. Go back to those things and go, he was faithful there. He was faithful there. In this circumstance, he will be faithful. And that's how we calculate it. That's what Abraham did. God knows exactly what he's doing in your life. Sometimes you think you know what's going on in your life, and it may not be so, but God always knows what's going on in your life. He's always there. And we can put our trust in him. And whatever God is wanting to do, and whatever God is requiring of you, it will always be beneficial. It will always be good for you. And so that's why when we read this verse 17, it says, by faith Abraham, you ought to be able to say by faith Daryl, or by faith Rihanna, or by faith Richard, or by faith John, or by whatever. I excluded some of you. It doesn't mean you haven't got faith. It's just I can't have the time to run through you all. But you know what? That's how it would be. By faith. By faith, I move out. By faith, I speak to that person. By faith, I do what God requires of me. Because I know that he's faithful. I can reckon on that. Can't you reckon on that? How God is faithful. We move on. Verse 20, it says, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instruction concerning his bones. And these three are, it's interesting that they're just little spots that the writer puts in here about those that followed on from Abraham. And just to let us know that faith in God is the primary instrument by which each one of those lived. Even in the face of death, they still put their trust in God. And even though Isaac tried to get around God's stated intention that the elder would serve the younger, or that the first would serve the second that came out of his wife. When the crunch came, and even though there was a little bit of shall we say deception by Jacob, Isaac blessed Jacob. But when the crunch came and Esau was, haven't you got a blessing for me? And he gave him a blessing, but he said, Isaac's got the blessing from God. And then he recognized that this is of God. And so even when he come to the end of his life, even though he'd done a lot of really stuff that wasn't so honouring to God, at the end, Isaac was found to be faithful. Jacob the same way. On his deathbed, he recalled all the promises of God, that came through the lineage of Abraham, and he blessed all his sons, the sons in accordance with that promise from God, and he spoke to them about the eventual settling in the promised land of Canaan. And so it says that's where he's able to say, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed. And he said, this is what's happening. The land that God has promised through our father Abraham. And of course, and then Joseph, his story in Genesis 50, when he was on his deathbed as well, the beautiful thing, he was talking about the promise that God had given for Canaan, the promise that God had given down through Abraham of the land of Canaan. And he said, listen, I know that's going to come to pass. So when it does, I want you to pick up my bones and take them with you and bring me to that land that God has promised. Such was his faith. They didn't see any of that, but they remained steadfast in the promises of God. And so, you know what, despite their shortcomings, and here's a little lesson, despite the shortcomings of these three guys and the faults that they had, in the end, their faith came through. They acknowledged God's promise through Abraham. And so it was there, you know, and I just kind of think God is so faithful and so patient, so long-suffering, that we have our slips and our stumblings, and you might slip around a little bit. It might be like you're walking on that, what they call that, black ice, you know, you just, your feet go out, and you're trying to stand up, you know, your walk might be like that. But you know what, God is looking at the heart, and we maintain our faith in Him to be able to do what He wants to do. And it's just a beautiful thing here that in spite of all the faults, God ensured that these three guys were mentioned in this letter as men of faith. Somebody said it this way, and I like it. God is glorified when His people leave this world with their flags flying at full mast. And you know what? And it is so true, isn't it? Here's these guys with all their faults, you know, Isaac and Jacob, and, you know, they're having their faults and just, you know, bits of mess up, you know, attitudes, deception, you name it. There were things that were there in their lives, but you know, when the crunch came down to the end, and they said, you know what? God is faithful. God is faithful. Everything we do, we must look forward to the promise that God gave us. And so I like that quote, you know, He's glorified when His people leave this world with their flags flying at full mast. These guys died not seeing the promise, not seeing it all come to pass. Yet they kept the vision and they passed it on to their children. That's a great lesson here for parents. You know, God gives you an understanding of His word, and we have a vision, don't we, that there will come a day, you know, and wouldn't it be just so great to be able to live long enough to hear the trumpet? And, you know, you're trying to picture it, you know. What's it going to be in the twinkling of an eye, and it would be so great. But you know what? The reality is some of us are not going. Okay? Not necessarily the oldest, but it's just the reality of God's timing for each one of us. But let's not lose the vision. Let's keep the flag flying at high mast. I don't see it yet, but man, I'm keeping my eyes upon it. Just like Abraham. Keeping our eyes upon the vision of eternity with Christ and in the presence of the Father. How awesome that will be. The other thing I notice here is that down through the line from Abraham, they had been passing this on. As parents, as the dads, they've been passing on this vision. So that all the way down the line, they were recalling, even at their point of leaving this earth, they were recalling the vision and the promise of God. Because it had been spoken to them. They'd been trained, they'd been taught it. So as a parent, you know, there's a huge responsibility for us to teach our children and give them the opportunity to know what we know. And leave that as like a heritage. Let's pass the vision on to wherever. Let's move on, Moses. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw that he was a beautiful child. I think my mum and dad saw that in me. And so they didn't hide me in a basket. They might have wanted to, but anyway. because they saw that he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. What a great story. What an awesome story. The story back in the Old Testament about the new ruler that didn't know Joseph and didn't have an understanding of all those things, and so he's fearful about the increase of the Israelites, and said to the midwives, when the mums are about to give birth, you see it's a boy, you kill him. And of course, and the daughters are okay, but of course they couldn't do that, so they made up a story. Then he gave instructions at the end of the chapter. It says that okay, I want all the firstborn sons to be killed. Of course, here's Moses' mum and dad. I'm wondering whether they sensed something special about him. Maybe God did something in their hearts to let them know that he was special. And we know the story that Moses hid him in the bulrushes and so forth, and recognising possibly the favour of God. And so she really did put a trust in God. And that's what it says here. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents. And it was just, they trusted God. Said, well, God, you gave us this little boy. And we know that there is this decree to kill. And so they made this little basket and put the pitch around so it could just float and wouldn't sink into the bulrushes and all. But you know what? God in his greatness caused the daughter of Pharaoh to come along, and she found him. And God in all his awesomeness caused the servant of Pharaoh's daughter to say, let me get one of the Hebrew women to look after him. And who should it be? Surprise, surprise, but Moses' mum. And we know the story how she then had him until he became a young man. And so she had all those years still to input into him. All about the promises of God for the children of Israel. All about the great and mighty Creator, their sovereign God. And so she inputted, no doubt his father, they inputted into Moses. And so, by faith, they did that. And by faith, they saw the benefit as God gave them the child back so that they could raise him up. What an awesome story there. But it says there, and it goes on, says, by faith, when he became of age, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh and all. And we know that story too, how he made that choice not to be a part of Pharaoh's family. And I find that so intriguing with the guy, because he knew what it was to experience all the wealth and the riches and the fame and so forth that came by living as a son of Pharaoh in the palace, having all that greatness and all that wealth, the temptation of it. And yet it says here, by faith, when he became of age, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh. Mum's input over those growing years remained in him. And then faith in Moses saw him identified with the Israelites. What about, the passing pleasures of sin? How temporary. That's what the word means, the passing pleasure. It's temporary. It's transient. And so everything that people get involved in finishes somewhere along the line. And so Moses had the ability to see that all that stuff was passing. It was temporary. It was transient. He says, I don't even want to enjoy the passing, the transient pleasure, because even the reproach of Christ is greater. What a heart. What is sin? Well, you and I know that sin is simply falling short of the glory of God. And you know that anything that intrudes into your life that distracts you from the Lord, that's sin. Anything that detracts from your relationship with God, that you let get in the way of your walking with Him on a daily basis, is sin. It's falling short of the glory of God. It's falling short of what God has in mind for you, the best that He has for you. anything that's in our lives today that causes God and our relationship to Him as a child of His to be diminished is sin. Can you imagine the opportunities that Moses had in that palace? Whoa! You know, running around as Pharaoh's son and getting into roles of authority and being involved in all the officialdom that goes on. But he said, it's nothing. It's nothing. What made that decision? It was the faith that Moses had in the promises of God for the children of Israel. Listen, here I am with all these great pleasures before me. Here I am with all this great wealth before me. And then there's no reproach because I have all this this standing before the people. But his faith in the promises of God said, you know what, that's not worth the risk. I'll suffer the reproach of Christ with the children of Israel because I know where that's leading. Far, far greater. And that's by faith. Some of you might have opportunity. Some of us, we've shot it past. We'll never see it again. But the reality is some of you might have the opportunity to become extremely wealthy and be a person of prestige and all that. You know, see how I have great confidence in you now. That. But you know, but you know what? It's you're going to get those temptations, maybe. The temptation to get as much money in the bank as you can. The temptation to have a bigger and better car, a bigger and better house, and all those sorts of things. But I want to tell you, Moses tells us that they are passing. They're transient. They don't last. You might look great amongst people, and it might be that you're held in high esteem by people of the world. But you know what? It means nothing to God. But if you say, you know what, I've got that opportunity to grab that and to go with that and to have that all to myself, or I can suffer the ridicule of being a Jesus freak or a follower, you know, of that Jesus Christ and be reproached almost. But I'm taking that because by faith I see the promises of God. That's a decision we make, the same as Moses made, you know. And I don't throw that out to say, to beat you about the brow with it, but I'm just saying that's a pressure that we face each day. It may be on that scale, but it may be on a smaller scale as well. So we just need to always have that attitude of Moses. You know what? The passing pleasure of sin is not worthy to be even considered with what God has for us. The reality is, you know, sin will entice us. From, you know, is that a surprise to you? No. Sin will entice us, but the reality is there is no great, long-lasting benefit of it. All this earthly stuff is temporary. Temporary. I was talking to Richard this morning about our cars. I said, how's your car going? And he says, no, it's not bad, going as it should for something that's gone over 400,000 kilometres, you know. And we're back home. He said, you know what? He said, cars are for one thing. It's for getting you from A to B. It doesn't matter about all the other hoo-ha about it, you know, oh, I like this big flashy car and all that. If God puts it in your carport, take it. But if He doesn't, don't look at it and get all hung up about it. It's all temporary. It's temporary. And don't let anyone deceive you that that's the be-all and end-all of life. It's not. You can work your whole life, and you can have a bank full of money, and you can have all the best of everything. But if you don't have Christ, you've got absolutely nothing. Nothing. By faith, Moses said, I don't need all that Pharaoh stuff. Because there's something far, far greater. Does it mean I'll be ridiculed and be under reproach? Yeah. But the end, the long term, is so magnificent. Psalm 16 and 11 said, Thou make me to know the path of life. In your presence, Lord, there is fullness of joy. At your right hand, there is bliss forevermore. And so Moses understood where the greater riches were. And I pray that as Christians we would understand where the greater riches are. Many years ago, I read this little story, and I used to do little radio time slots in Albany, and I remember using this little story, and the basic gist of it was, you know what, little hands come into the world